Hello, and welcome to Chapter 7, The Political Economy of International Trade. Um, let's start off the chapter by talking about China and rare earth metals. So, what are rare earth metals? These are chemical elements that are extremely rare. Quantities are very limited, and the process for extracting these chemicals highly toxic and highly specialized. But these rare earth metals are used in all the products we love: iPads, iPhones, televisions, advanced computers, batteries, all the good stuff. Now, if a country has extremely tight environmental restrictions, like the United States, it's not going to be easy to manufacture and produce and extract um, rare earth metals because it's a dirty, toxic process, and it would require just too much effort and money to do it in countries like Australia, Canada, United States. Now, China recently became the world's leading exporter of rare earth metals, and they accounted for about 95% of all rare earth metals. Now, as China's economy grew and their need for rare earth metals exploded, they reduced their quota for exporting from 50 tons to 30 tons, leaving the rest of the world in a shortage of these rare earth metals, which dramatically increased the price of them. Now, when China ramped up their production of rare earth metals, they put out of business since they were able to do it more effectively with less environmental restrictions. They put out of business a huge number of companies producing these rare earth metals around the globe. Once they pulled back their exporting tonnage, the prices shot up quickly, putting many foreign manufacturers at a cost disadvantage. So, leading some people to believe, was this specifically an attempt by China to give its domestic manufacturers a cost advantage? Or was it something to motivate other manufacturers around the world to relocate their manufacturing inside of China so they would be excluded from having to import these rare earth metals? Um, However, what eventually did happen is didn't really encourage many people to start manufacturing inside of China specifically for rare earth metals, but it did encourage a vast number of companies to redesign their products and rework their products so that they wouldn't need to include any um, rare earth metals. They found substitutes, specifically automotive companies that used probably the most rare earth metals. Um, they've worked very hard to replace these rare earth metals with more common metals. So what happens with this remains to be seen, but this is an example of issues that can come up with economies and political intervention in trade. Okay. So when we talk about free trade, and we're referring to when we refer to free trade, we're talking about governments who do not attempt to restrict its citizens from what they can buy or sell from other countries. Now, most nations are moving towards or committing strongly to free trade, but even a nation like the United States, which is often spearheading these free trade efforts, they still have some protectionist policies in certain cases. So we're going to look at some of those and talk about that. Because politically, if you have a democratically elected governing officials, they're going to want to placate the voters on special interests in certain areas of the country where certain subsidies or quotas or bans or tariffs would be popular to garnish votes. So it's part of one of the drawbacks of people who have to earn votes is that they sometimes have to do things that aren't long term in the nation's best interest. Okay. Now, so let's look at a couple of these issues here. So we've talked in previous chapters about free trade, and I think pretty much most of the class and myself are leaning to free trade is a good thing for the world economy. It promotes growth, it promotes better jobs, it raises more people out of poverty. In the last 15 years, an additional 200 million people were raised out of poverty due to free trade economics. Now, we also talked about some of the downsides of free trade, which is, the ever-expanding amount of trade puts a strain on the world's resources, increases the global pollution, and can lead to some painful shifts in jobs and replacements of jobs as companies and manufacturing and service jobs move to the areas of the world where they're most effective. So this is some issues we've been talking about. So here's a question for you: How do governments intervene in international trade? And there are a number of instruments. We're going to talk about all of them: tariffs, subsidies, import quotas, voluntary export restraints, voluntary export restraints, local content requirements, and anti-dumping policies, and lastly, administrative policies. So let's look at tariffs. What is a tariff? Well, it's basically a tax, and it's tax levied on imports that raise the cost of the imported product into the domestic territory. So, for example, if your country makes brooms and it takes $10 to make a broom, and you sell them for $20, and yet another imports of foreign brooms are coming in at a cost of $2 and they're selling for $5, it's going to put your domestic broom manufacturer out of business. So there'll be pressure to raise a tariff of, say, $15 on imported brooms. So now the imported brooms will sell at the same price as the domestic brooms. And that would be, a basic specific tariff that would tax a particular item for the benefit of the local production. Now consumers lose out because now consumers are having to pay a higher price for brooms than they would have if there wasn't any tariffs. So ad valorem tariffs are specifically targeted to a proportion of the value of the imported goods. In most cases, tariffs are placed on imports to protect domestic producers from foreign competition by raising the price of imported goods. However, tariffs also produce revenue for the government. Unlike income tax, the government receives income tax would be the number one source of revenue for the U.S. government. But it wasn't so long ago where tariffs were the biggest source. Of income. But now, they've significantly reduced the amount of tariffs that they levy against imports, and with the amount of free trade agreements, the tax revenue from tariffs has declined significantly, but there still exist in some specific cases are still there today. So why are they imposing these tariffs? In some cases, in some countries, if they don't have a large income tax, they may want to use the tariffs to increase government revenue. Specifically, most countries do it to protect domestic production. And they do, all right, that's all I'm going to say about that. Let's move on to subsidies. Okay, so this has been in the news a lot lately. Now, a subsidy is basically a government giving money to domestic producer, and they take the form of, it could be grants, low interest loans, tax breaks. For example, Suffolk County may want to encourage a employer to stay on Suffolk County and even build a world headquarters, and they may say, we'll release you from paying tax for 10 years. Or they may even provide subsidies for energy, reduce costs on electric and different things to help them, encourage them to stay. Or a subsidy can be the U.S. government may want to subsidize solar panel manufacturers to encourage the industry to take more risk and set up bigger operations and invest more in research development in solar energy, something that the U.S. wants to dominate. Now, these subsidies can lower production costs and help domestic producers in two ways: compete against foreign competition by lowering their costs and gaining export markets by helping them compete against foreign producers. Um, you know, there are close to $300 billion to $500 billion, depending on the year, of subsidies in the world that governments provide to companies. And there's much more than that, that a lot of times the governments will provide subsidies that are off the radar. So they're not reported and they're not known because they don't want foreign competition to say, oh, the U.S. government is injecting $100 billion into batteries or solar panels. Well, we're going to have to also do that. So if they can do it without other countries realizing how much they're subsidizing, and there's a lot of World Court, WTO, World Trade Organization cases where one country is trying to prove that another country is illegally subsidizing an industry. Now, recently, automobile manufacturers have received subsidies. If you look at GM and Chrysler, the U.S. government was involved in subsidizing them during the last Great Recession to prevent them from closing and laying off tons of workers. So in that case, we could see how that subsidy was a temporary one-time subsidy to get these companies back on their feet and move them forward. So subsidies are not necessarily a bad thing. They can really help level the playing field if a country is rather small and they want to really get into a market that it's not easy for them to compete against the size of economy compared to the United States or China. So government can assist. And it's fairly common. I think Boeing is one of the largest companies that received a fair amount of subsidies from the three countries, I think it's England, France, and Germany primarily, who formed to create and develop a aircraft manufacturer that can compete with Boeing. All right. And one can also say that Boeing got a lot of subsidies through military contracts from the U.S. government to keep them growing and research development and things of that nature as well. All right. Okay, so let's look at some import quotas. Now, an import quota is a restriction on the quantity of goods that may be imported into a country. And the restriction is usually enforced by issuing an import license to a group of individuals or firms. So say in the United States, there is a quota on cheese imports. So the only firms allowed to import cheese are certain trading companies, each of which is allocated the right to import a maximum number of pounds of cheese each year. In some cases, the right to sell is directly to the government of exporting countries. Historically, this is the case for sugar and textile imports to the United States. However, the international agreement governing the imposition of import quotas on textiles, the multi-fiber agreement, expired in 2004. Now, so you could see that, a country may just say, this is, you are allowed to import 100,000 cars from Germany, that's it. And it's a way of limiting the competition from foreign firms into the United States or any country. Now, there's also a tariff rate quota. It's also applied to imports. Within the quota, So there is a lower tariff applied to imports within the quota than those over the quota. So, for example, there may be a limit. It could be sort of a stepped situation where there's a 10% tariff for the first 50,000 imported and a 20% for the next 100,000, sort of like that. Now, a voluntary export restraint is a foreign country voluntarily limiting the amount of exports into another country. And this is primarily, we saw this mostly with Japan. In the 80s, there was this hysteria. Japan's taking over. Japan's going to be the number one economy. We're buying too many Japanese products, so especially automobiles. So the Japanese government, fearing a more punitive tariffs on their automobiles from the U.S. Congress, voluntarily restricted the amount of automobiles that could enter the United States from Japan. Now, appeasing the rhetoric at the time of, buy domestic. And now, the reason the Japanese sold so many cars to the United States in the 80s was that the American cars who dominated the American market manufacturers got lazy in the 70s and started building new generations of vehicles that were worse than the older generations. And I remember these cars. They just wouldn't start. They had plenty of mechanical problems. They broke down frequently. They were inferior products. These Japanese autos came in the late 70s, early 80s that were much higher quality, much more affordable, and they started to quickly overtake the American manufacturers. The end result was good though. The competition had forced the American manufacturers to step up the game, start reinvesting in their facilities and making better cars, which in the long run helped strengthen and increase the exports of GM, Ford, and Chrysler. And so the world competition, although it may take some time and may be unbalanced at first, generally for the auto industry has been a good thing, especially for the United States auto industry. And a lot of the workers who were displaced by the closing of some GM, Ford, or Chrysler automotive plants have been replaced with other Americans as Japanese and German auto manufacturers opened up auto manufacturing plants inside the United States specifically to get around certain tariffs and be exempt from being counted as a foreign import. Because if a Honda is manufactured inside the United States and sold inside the United States, it's not an import. Okay. We have this quota rent, that extra profits that producers make when supply is artificially limited by an import quota. All right. Those are not common at all. So who benefits from import quotas and voluntary export restraints? And the answer is import quotas and voluntary export restraints benefit domestic producers by limiting the competition and raising the prices of the imported goods, so domestic producers could either raise their prices or take advantage of the price differential and sell more cars. But who suffers from, of course, the exporters suffer, and the consumer of the domestic economy suffer because now they're having to pay artificially higher prices, and in some cases, they may be forced to buy domestic supply when international imports are sold out. Now, local content requirements are specifically something that's an automobile phenomenon. And what they did is they'll say that you can make your foreign automobile, but it must contain 25% of domestic auto parts inside of it. Or even if you're going to produce manufacture a car in the United States, then maybe a requirement that a certain percentage of the auto parts are also manufactured in the United States. So for the auto industry, you could see that if Honda wanted to manufacture their Accords in Ohio, that they wouldn't do it with 100% Japanese parts, that they would have to use local auto parts manufacturers, or if they wanted to export foreign vehicles into the United States, sometimes there's a requirement that a certain amount of the parts are from U.S. producers. And this is another way to maintain and stimulate local jobs. But it's going to be an end result, in some cases, lower quality and higher prices for consumers. Administrative trade policies. Um, So governments sometimes use informal and administrative policies to restrict imports and boost exports. And this has been a favorite of many countries, including Japan, where they won't specifically say there's a limitation on imports, but they'll put up all these crazy administrative policies that makes it next to impossible for, say, a rice producer in the United States to export to Japan. So they're bureaucratic rules designed to make it difficult for imports to enter the country. And it has been argued that the Japanese are the master of this trade barrier. And in recent decades, Japan's formal tariff and non-tariff barriers have been among the lowest in the world. However, because the country's informal administrative barriers to imports are so comprehensive and so effective, they don't need to have stated tariffs and things of that nature. So it makes it seem like they're very, Japan wants to seem to be very trade friendly because they don't want anybody to put tariffs on their products, but they use these administrative ways to get what they want in sort of a sneakier way. You know, so you can see that these administrative trade policies are a way to prevent certain products to be imported without having to really make a strong statement like a tariff or quota. Okay. And let's talk about anti-dumping policies. So what is dumping? Dumping is basically the whether it's government supported or just a couple of aggressive companies, they go into a foreign market, they dump their products at below cost, get the domestic manufacturers to go out of business, and then aggressively raise prices. So it's a pretty sneaky thing to do, and it's very, it happens more often than you think. I remember there was a case where I think it was a Korean company was dumping, of all things, photo albums, which aren't relevant today anymore because we don't use photo albums. And some of you may remember these when we had our photos printed at the local pharmacy or whatnot. We would take our photographs and put them in a book and stick them onto these pages, and we'd have our photo albums. And this Korean company was barred from selling them inside the United States because they were considered dumping and selling them below cost, and with nearly putting out our two domestic producers of photo albums. Then came NAFTA. NAFTA was ratified, and the Korean company actually had an aggressive policy to export the photo albums to Mexico, and then Mexico would bring them to the United States. So they kind of circumvented the anti-dumping policy against them. So there's been a long history of companies using this to gain an unfair advantage and have predatory pricing behavior. With producers using substantial profits from their home markets or from support from the governments to subsidize prices in foreign markets, so driving the competition out of the market. Now, two other South Korean manufacturers, Hyundai and Semicon LG, which you may know it by, were accused of dramatically reducing the cost of memory chips, sometimes called DRAM, in the U.S. below the cost of production. And this action occurred in the middle of a worldwide glut of computer making capacity, and it was alleged that these firms were trying to unload their excessive production in the United States, and they would figure that they could dump them here since they produced them anyway and help drive out domestic producers, and then the supply and demand would balance the way that prices would increase and they would have no competition. So if these when a country realizes that their certain products are being attacked and dumped, they can create anti-dumping policies, which are designed to punish the foreign firms for engaging in this dumping activity. But the objective is to protect the domestic producers from this unfair competition. Um, and a lot of times, many of these dumping targets are companies in the U.S. All right. I know that I was actually reading an article about inside the vitamin industry, there were a number of Chinese manufacturers that were trying to corner the market on certain nutrients, where they were dumping certain ingredients that go into most vitamins at a very low price, successfully putting out domestic manufacturers, and then dramatically raising the prices afterwards. Though no direct anti-dumping policies have been established, because they've been attacking very small industries with very little reach or political clout to garnish to encourage the government to put up any anti-dumping policies against them. And there's also political ramifications if the U.S. Can start a trade war if they are putting up too many anti-dumping policies that aren't warranted or have no real exact case for them, other than trying to use that as a way to increase their protectionism. Okay. Now, a lot of times, if they believe that a firm is dumping, they can file a complaint with the government, and the government, if they find merit in it, they can impose duties or tariffs on the company that's dumping. And there's been from memory chips to tires to textiles to many different industries at one time or another, anti-dumping policies have been enacted. All right. One such thing, as far as dumping, would be solar panels. Now, the Chinese have invested a huge amount of money in their capacity to manufacture solar panels, which is good. But there has been complaints that their solar panels are too cheap, and it put a lot of European manufacturers of solar panels, especially in Germany, at risk. And it called for some anti-dumping legislation. And there's also been some talk of that in the U.S. as well, as many of the U.S. manufacturers, who some of them have been subsidized by the U.S. government, have failed in face of the Chinese competition. As far as I'm concerned, I think that the aggressive investment by the Chinese in solar panels is a good thing, and if it encourages other governments to subsidize and increase the research, development, and production of solar panels to help drive down prices, that's going to be overall a benefit for the entire world, because we need as many solar panels as we can generate, and we need them at a price that's going to be cheaper than fossil fuels. I think solar is really going to be the one way that we can get out of this global climate disaster the quickest. So I'm in favor. If the Chinese government wants to spend billions subsidizing and encouraging a solar panel market, I am all for it. And we should be doing the same. So the Europeans shouldn't be, fighting the Chinese on this. They should be stepping up to the competition and supporting their domestic economies, rather than trying to fight the imports of Chinese solar panels. I think that would be, but governments do need to intervene in trade, will intervene in trade because number one, political arguments. They want to protect their local interests and garnish votes and, see that they're doing something positive for the home economy. And they want to build the overall wealth of their nation. But if they get too protectionist, then it's going to decrease world trade and have a negative impact. So there is trade intervention or government intervention in trade. In some cases, in some specific cases, can be good. But overall, if it's going to limit the amount of free trade, not good. And as far as the political arguments, the number one political argument is jobs. We have to save our jobs, and we don't want the jobs to disappear because that is where the government receives a lot of money in income tax and a lot of support. Working people who make decent money are very happy citizens, and they don't want that. There's also national security to protect industries that are important for national security. In fact, during World War II, diamonds were very much a national priority because they're used in manufacturing. And diamonds are sometimes the only thing that can cut other substances because they're so hard. And the U.S. government, seeing a threat of being cut off from their importation of diamonds, developed a process to manufacture diamonds artificially. So the U.S. government actually funded and developed a procedure where they can make artificial diamonds that can be used in industry. Not good for wedding rings and such because they have a lot of impurities in them, but good enough for the defense industry and their production of weapons in time of war. So example of national security. Now, retaliation, when governments take or threaten to take specific actions, other countries may remove trade barriers. So, there could be this political stammering where we're going to threaten you, you threaten us, and they back and forth to try to get the ultimate goal of removing certain barriers. So the mere threat, and the U.S. is very influential in this part because our market is the largest market. So if we say, listen, if you don't do this, we're going to bar your exports into our country, they have a lot of sway. So sometimes it's a posturing that can help by threatening the retaliation. And for protecting consumers for unsafe products. Sometimes it's not about saving jobs or industries. Sometimes it's just that these foreign imports are dangerous. They have lead paint. They have toxic chemicals. U.S. itself has been a victim of this. European Union have protective consumer laws on agricultural goods that are GMO, genetically modified organisms, like our corn and our wheat and our soybeans. A lot of them are genetically modified by Monsanto to resist drought, resist bugs, and grow faster, and sort of what they call frankenfoods. So we can't sell certain crops overseas because of the protection to protect consumers from these dangerous genetically modified organisms. So that's something that one area where we're very vulnerable because the U.S. has been the leader in developing these what they call frankenfoods, which you most likely eat every day. For example, I read an article about how they took some genetic from a spider, a gene from a spider, and put it into a tomato, and the tomato can now produce a pesticide inside the tomato, produces its own pesticide to keep bugs off of it, which to me is kind of gross because now I'm eating a tomato with pesticide already growing inside of it. I don't want that in my body, but these are things that when it comes to health concerns, other countries are a little bit more cautious than the U.S. has been. And there's been instances where specific corn that's genetically altered that should only be used to feed livestock got into our domestic supply. And I think it wound up in Taco Bell, taco corn shells or some stuff like that. I mean, there's a lot of crazy stories with this. Okay. Furthering government objectives like increasing, wanting to build strong relationships with certain countries, so they're going to give them, better status and accept more of their products. If we want to punish certain states like North Korea or Cuba or Iran, we can punish them by putting some trade restriction policies or even sanctions. Um, you know, all right, all right, okay. Human rights is another big issue. Protecting, promoting human rights in other countries is an important element of foreign policy. And especially the U.S. government, they want to use trade policy to try and improve human rights policies for their trading partners. We talked about this a little bit in Chapter 5. So we have, the U.S. government has a long history of sanctions in place against a country, say Myanmar, due to their poor human rights practices in the nation. Things have turned around in the country recently, and the U.S. has been removing some of those human rights protections. So it's a way of, fostering and promoting our democratic ideals of inalienable human rights across the globe. All right. So it's a way to get countries to treat their citizens better. I don't, and in a lot of foreign countries, they don't like the U.S. influencing how they treat their citizens. But when you dangle MFN, most favored nation status, in front of a country, they sometimes will work with the U.S. to improve these human rights privileges. Okay, moving on. Arguments for intervention. You have an infant industry like solar power that the government wants to make stronger and wants to have a domestic industry in certain manufacturing, new manufacturing of certain products. You want to get a toehold, such as you want to get, such in this country, you want to get solar panels and advanced batteries to be a big industry because we know those are going to be big sellers in the future. So governments want to protect these industries from international competition that may be stronger until they're strong enough to stand on their own. So this is allowable, but the argument has been, it's useless unless the industry uses the money and the time to become more effective and really become a global competitor. If it's just something that the industry is going to take as a gift and not really become a global competitor, then you're sort of fostering failure. So there's a lot of pros and cons of this. Now, in this day and age, if a country can be innovative enough, they can actually compete without a tremendous amount of subsidies. However, manufacturing companies still do need that extra push for research development because it's so cost intensive to make, the next generation of solar panels or the next generation of batteries. They're sometimes required if the government wants to be in that. Now, as far as strategic trade policies, this could have two sides to it. The first is the argument that appropriate actions a government can help raise national income if it can somehow ensure that the firms that gain first mover advantage in industry are domestic rather than foreign enterprises. According to strategic trade policy argument, a government should use subsidies to support promising firms that are active in newly emerging industries. And specifically in the area of research, development, and innovation. And this is, the government has helped many local, through various grants and subsidies, many local startups to become full-fledged big companies, rather than just having a domestic company, a foreign company come in and dominate the industry. Now, if you look at something like liquid crystal display screens, LCD, these were invented in the United States, just like the microwave, the VCR, the television. However, the Japanese government, in cooperation with other major electronics companies, targeted this industry for research support, and the result was that Japanese firms, not U.S. firms, captured the first mover advantage in this market, limiting U.S. manufacturers from making these. if we look at the new TVs today, American manufacturers hold a significant amount of patterns in the new televisions, the new cell phones, and things of that nature, but they usually lose ground on the manufacturing side. So sometimes governments may want to actually put money in to help these companies have a first mover advantage and not be overtaken by domestic manufacturers so quickly. Sometimes this works, sometimes this doesn't work, but you could see the motivation for it. Okay, so let's look at the case for free trade again. So the new trade theorists that we talked about last chapter believe that government intervention in international trade is justified. And some new trade theories believe that while strategic trade theory is appealing in theory, it may not be workable in practice. And there's been plenty of success and failures on both sides of this area. So there are a couple situations where trade restrictions are inappropriate. One, of course, is retaliation that could set up a trade war. So if countries are punishing each other and retaliating, you put these levies and tariffs against this product in our country, so we're going to not buy any Boeing aircrafts, and we're going to restrict that, so we're going to buy all our aircrafts from Airbus. And so countries can get petty, and this tit-for-tat type of trade war is really not a good situation. Also, domestic policies. Governments do not always act in national interest when they intervene in the economy. So politically important interest groups can influence them, especially in the United States, where we have lobbyists. Also, the European Union, support for a common agricultural policy, or CAP as they call it, which arose because of political power of France and German farmers. CAP benefits inefficient farmers and the politicians who rely on the farm vote, but not consumers in the European Union, who end up paying more for food. So these things can backfire, and that's why a lot of people come to the U.S. and they're amazed at how cheap the food prices are here on certain items. Okay, so a trade war is never a good thing, and this happened a couple of times, and it's really both countries are worse off for it. And we've had many trade wars with Japan, many trade wars with China, and Taiwan, and these generally are not good for anybody and strain domestic relationships of the two countries, who are usually on otherwise friendlier terms. And domestic policies, anytime you cater to special interest groups, the whole country as a whole will have to suffer and pay larger prices because of certain interest groups that are really not in the whole country's best efforts. Okay, so the development of the free trade or the world trading system has changed a great deal. There's a great video out called Commanding Heights that talk a lot about this, and I think I'm going to try to put a link up if I can find it on YouTube. But we had this GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was sort of the first framework after World War II to govern world trade. And this has since transformed into the World Trade Organization, which you may have known because the World Trade Organization gets a lot of negative press from protesters. Now, up until and before the Great Depression, most countries had a lot of protectionism on their industries, and including the U.S. And this was blamed in part for creating the Great Depression and making it worse. As everybody started trying to protect the domestic industries, world trade fell greatly because of this. Now, and World War II, sort of a direct result of poor economic times. Now, in the period of 47 to 79, GATT membership grew significantly, tariffs were reduced, and regulations were enforced and monitored, in creating a much more friendly world trade environment, and world trade skyrocketed From 1980 to 1993, there was some strain due to Japan's. Anytime a country becomes very successful, like Japan in the 80s, the U.S. gets jealous, or China today, the U.S. gets jealous, and their people get angered, and we feel like we should always be number one. And a lot of trade restrictions are politically supported and can kind of put limits on the growth of world trade as more tariffs and anti-dumping legislation starts moving through the system. So we had a slowing period in the 80s because of this, but then an acceleration after this period had ended. There was a real acceleration, specifically in the 90s, where different rounds of World Trade Organizations helped to secure service and intellectual properties, develop the World Trade Organization that would further encourage world trade and discourage protectionism policies. And here are some specific focuses of that trade, of the Uruguay round of negotiations. Okay, so here are some of the specifics. Following provisions. One, tariffs on international goods were to be reduced by more than 1/3, and tariffs would be scrapped on more than 40% of manufacturing goods. Number two, average tariff rates imposed by developing nations on manufacturing goods would to be reduced to be less than 4% of value, the lowest level in modern history. Agricultural subsidies were to be substantially reduced, although there's been a lot of problems with agricultural subsidies. Let's see. Specifically, the BRIC countries, Brazil, India, China, Russia, this has really been a stumbling block for a lot of the world trade rounds, has been the agricultural subsidies. But anyway, four, GATT, fair trade and market access rules were to be extended to cover a wider range of services. GATT rules were to be extended to provide enhanced protection for patents, copyrights, and trademarks, something very important to the U.S. 6, barriers on trade and textiles would be significantly reduced over 10 years. And 7, the World Trade Organization would be created to implement the GATT agreement. So this Uruguay round was a very important round in '86 and set the stage for the World Trade Organization to be a force for expanding world trade. And most countries have adopted these recommendations by the World Trade Organizations and brokered reform in global telecommunications, financial service industry, and things of that nature. You may remember in 1999 there was a big meeting in Seattle, which was plagued with protests and popular opinion about how too aggressive world trade was bad for citizens of the world due to abuses of, human rights and things of that nature. Now, the World Trade Organization is most focused on currently establishing and looking at anti-dumping policies. Protectionism of agricultural product, protecting intellectual properties, market access for non-agricultural goods and services. There was a new round in Doha. They started picking locations around the world that weren't so common and would be hard to protest after Seattle. But in this round, the Doha round, which wasn't successfully completed, they were focused on cutting tariffs, phasing out subsidies for agricultural products, and that was the real failing of this Doha round, reducing barriers to cross-border investment, and limiting the use of anti-dumping laws. Now, as far as managers are concerned, if you want to work in a company that's going to be involved in exporting to other countries, you're going to have to deal with these trade barriers, develop a strategy to get your products into the foreign markets, and work within the free trade system to help hopefully um, navigate all these trade barriers. So if you're a manager of any international departments or products, you're going to really come across these protectionisms, and the way that your company skillfully navigates these can mean the difference between a profitable, successful business and one that is going to be strained and possibly shut down. So it's a huge, huge issue for today's global managers. As far as trade barriers, they're going to definitely, in certain, depending on the industry you're in, they're going to can really potentially limit your amount of sales. Now, these trade barriers, as far as a company is concerned, is going to raise your cost of exporting. It could limit the amount of products you can export. You may have to have strategies like the Japanese and German auto manufacturers to relocate production inside of countries to meet local content regulations or circumvent quota limits, and develop an overall strategy that's going to keep abreast of the latest trade legislations and trade environments in countries to prevent any real consequences to your company. Um, you know. So bigger companies will have to lobby and work to prevent protectionism and prevent governments of other countries from limiting them. So it's something going to be a sort of political wrangling, and a lot of money will have to be spent lobbying to make sure that your company isn't shut out of certain markets. Sometimes this can backfire if you're too successful, and they can get an impression that you're controlling the government's political process and bribing and using money to get your way. And this is something that a lot of foreign governments and companies have been accused of using the U.S. lobbying system to get their products in the hands of U.S. consumers and hurting domestic industry. So, so it's a lot to think about. That's the end of this chapter. I look forward to talking to you about Chapter 8, the next chapter, where we're going to be talking about foreign direct investment and how that helps influence world trade. So I will talk to you then. Take care.